Hello there, my name is Will Patillo. I'm on the onboarding team at PauseAI. This presentation is about communicating for a pause, how to have effective conversations. The reason this is important is because AI safety requires bold policy changes. Policy proposals require popular support, which means we need to be convincing in shifting public opinion and getting them more active so that we can get the momentum necessary to have good policy to mitigate the various dangers of AI. This presentation is not going to be on rhetoric or the specific talking points that you should be using. Rather, instead, I want to focus on how to understand your audience and make sure that you're having the right conversation. Something I hope you take away from this video, in addition to being able to classify your conversations and know which strategy to use, is also as a frame for any other advice or thoughts you have about communication, to think about what does this advice assume and when does it apply. It's not just a matter of there's good ways to talk about AI and bad ways to talk about AI. It's a matter of fitting the way you're talking to the right context. Communication is with an audience. It's not just something that happens in the void, it is between human beings. To make your communication effective, you need to understand who your audience is. And there's a lot of different variables that I'll be going over. What's their relationship to you? How engaged are they on the topic? How much do they agree or disagree? What is your purpose of conversation? Are you trying to change people's minds? Are you trying to find and recruit volunteers? Are you just trying to keep the idea in people's minds for activation that might happen later? What is the other person's background knowledge that you can assume without further explanation versus what has to be explained? What's their cultural reference frame? What kind of ideas are they going to be naturally sympathetic or resistant to? What are their specific points of resistance? If someone believes that AI is not coming soon, then talking about alignment is not going to make any sense. And then lastly, what is the medium of communication? Starting with relationship, I can think of any interaction between two people is being along a number of dimensions. And the ones that are the most relevant here are familiarity and status. Familiarity is how much do you like each other. On the left side, we have someone who dislikes you, that might be an opponent, and someone that you get along with pretty well is a collaborator or a friend. Along the status axis, up at the top is you have more status than the other person. So you're an expert or an official or a teacher. Lower status, you're a subordinate, employee, layperson, student, and so on. If you put these together, so a mentor-student relationship, the mentor is higher status because the information is expected to flow from the mentor to the student. But it's fairly familiar. The relationship between the two is hopefully positive. The important thing in knowing where you are in the relationship is that your perception matches that of the other person. You can have an effective conversation anywhere on here. However, if you see yourself as being more dominant than the other person sees you, then you're going to come across as overbearing. Whereas the opposite, if you're an expert and you're kind of talking as an equal, or you're equals and you're talking like you know less, that's going to make you seem kind of weak and passive. If you're acting more close than you are, say you're a total stranger and you're acting like their friend, it's going to seem invasive. If you're acting more distant than you really are, then it's going to be cold, standoffish, unfriendly. The person be thinking like, well, why does this person not like me? Next is the level of engagement. I find it helpful to use the marketing concept of the process funnel, where at the top of the funnel is the widest, the most people fit here, and this is usually low effort, low energy kinds of things. And then the goal is to move people down the funnel to the most active, most intensive kind of interaction. It's natural that at every point in the funnel, some people are going to bounce out and stop there. And that's okay, but hopefully it doesn't narrow too quickly or too much. So if you find that the entire funnel is very narrow right from the beginning, then it doesn't really matter how much you smooth out the process because no one's entering it. And so you got to widen the top of the funnel. But if you're getting lots of initial interest and almost everyone's dropping away really early, then that's where you need to put your focus. So it's just a little visual to know what to prioritize. At the top of the funnel, or really outside of it, there are people who are distracted or avoidant. So if I were to use a specific example, let's say you're handing out flyers. These are the people who are just walking by, they have a place to go. The most you're going to get is just a little sentence like, hey, are you concerned about AI? Next level is this someone who's idle. You need to grab their attention in order to have a conversation with them. So this is where you need like a really compelling lead line that catches people's interest with the hope of getting them to level 3, which is where they're curious, but their focus isn't totally on you. So an example of someone in the idle category is, say you're at a Saturday market and there's people wandering around like looking for something to interest them. Maybe they'll put their focus on you, or maybe they'll put their focus somewhere else. And so your goal is to be the most interesting thing around. When someone gets to level 3, this is where they're actually paying attention to you, but they're not super committed yet. If you're boring or something else grabs their attention, they could leave at any moment. And so this is where you need to be really interesting, really punchy, get to the point very quickly so that the conversation maintains their interest, and you can hopefully get them to level 4, which is genuinely engaged. This is where you can actually have a real conversation and is a very good place to be. Level 5, I'm just putting in here for completeness. It's pretty rare. This is a captive audience, someone who is really committed to being there, maybe even more committed to the conversation than you are, or there's just some reason why leaving isn't really an option. Say if you're creating a blog or video, the people scrolling through, looking at titles of things and deciding whether they want to click it is level 2. Once someone's clicked on your link and they're looking at your content, but it's the first few seconds or the first paragraph, they're deciding whether they want to read it anymore. That's the curious stage. And then when they're actually reading it, that's 4. And then if they're using it for a class report or something and they're trying to cite things, then that would be an example of a captive audience. Next is the scale of agreement. This is probably one of the most important slides here, where you can put everyone on a scale from 1 to 5 in terms of how much they agree or disagree. 1 is a strong disagreement, 5 is a strong agreement, 3 is undecided, 2 is moderate disagreement, 4 is moderate agreement. Your strategy is quite different at each of these points in the scale. One thing with all of these is realistically, you should only expect to move someone 1 point on the scale. Now, if you can do more than that, that's fantastic. Don't cap yourself at any particular ceiling. But often it takes time to, if you've said some things to move someone along the scale, they might not admit to that right away. And that change happens after the conversation when they've had some time to marinate on the ideas, let them sink in, really think about it some more. And then when they have another conversation, you might move them another point in the scale. There are some exceptions to that. Some people are just really open and can move from a 1 to a 5 in a single conversation. That's kind of abnormal. Most of the time, just as a starting point, expect to move 1 point along. So if someone's at a 1 where they just really strongly disagree, they're absolutely opposed to regulation, maybe effective accelerationist, for example. The goal here should be to build mutual respect. Show them that you are a real person, that you've given this some thought, that you're sincere in your beliefs, and just build the sense of respect. Because right now your goal here is to get them to chill out a little bit and understand that there's some ambiguity and that the certainty that things will go really well or that there isn't going to be a problem isn't really warranted by the facts. If someone is in a place of moderate disagreement, this is the place to start instilling doubt in that confidence, showing all the different ways that things could go wrong. This isn't a place to be super certain, to be like, oh, my PDOOM is 95%. This is a place to say, how do you really expect this to go well? Poke holes in that. Get them to really think, to get them to a place of being undecided where, okay, like I had this opinion, but now I could see that it could go either way. Like that's a really good conclusion when you're talking to someone who's a 2. Then if someone is in the 3, the undecided phase, this is where classic persuasion happens. Depending on the person, it could be based on listing out the rational arguments, or they could be appeals to intuitions, building off of things they seem to already believe. Level 4, when you're talking to someone who already agrees but is fairly moderate, this is the time to start reinforcing that belief and really draw them in. Show the full severity of the situation, the full scope of things, the sheer number of ways that things can go wrong. And then lastly, when you have someone who is at level 5 and they strongly agree, Continuing to reinforce that belief is preaching to the choir at that point. And so this is the time to start trying to activate them, convert their beliefs into action. See what ways can they volunteer or help be part of a cause? Because given the severity of the kinds of things we're talking about, if like someone really accepts that, they should be acting on it to every extent that they can. People are different in how much time they can devote, but usually there's something. Now, another way of thinking about the scale is in terms of the three types of political messaging: conversion, activation, and reinforcement. Starting with reinforcement, because this is just the default easiest strategy. You see it a lot on social media. An account just gives a continuous stream of facts and opinions or hot takes on the news that support a particular worldview. Reinforcement can look like a lot of things. It can be very thoughtful blog posts or videos. It can be low effort hot takes. It can be appealing to certain emotions and assumptions, like another safety expert has just walked out of OpenAI. How terrible. Or it can be more rational. Here's another 5 ways that AGI could come soon. The goal of reinforcement messaging is that it maintains attentions on a topic. It builds up their resistance to being converted from the other side. It also slowly moves them along the scale so that they're eventually primed for activation messaging. Activation, as I've mentioned, is getting passive believers to act on that. On the onboarding team, this is the vast majority of my communication is in the activation realm, because if someone's joined the server and says that they want to help and they're having a one-on-one meeting with me, it's because they believe in this cause pretty strongly. They might have a few reservations here and there, but mostly they're in the 4 to 5 category. And so my focus is really on saying, here's how you can help. A more common example of activation is in calls to action. One really good example of this is on the For Humanity podcast by John Sherman. Most of those videos I would categorize as a high effort, very thoughtful reinforcement with a mix of emotional and rational together. But then at the end, there's often a segment for, and now go right to your local politician and tell them to take AI safety seriously. That's a call to action. That's getting these people watching the videos who've just had their views reinforced and reinforced to finally now try to act on them. And that's a really good pattern in messaging. The requirements of activation is this is where you really need to grab people's full attention. Appeals to emotion make a lot of sense here. It's also very important to be authentic and relatable. Speaking of the For Humanity podcast, one concept John talks about a lot is like, isn't it strange how people in AI safety are constantly calm and reasonable and talking about the risks as if they're talking about the weather or something? And if we think that the world's going to end, shouldn't we be out there like shaking people and say, we need to deal with this right now? Isn't there an incongruity with being calm when the stakes are so high? As far as the incongruity goes, that's a little bit complicated. But in terms of effectiveness, I like to think of it in terms of where you are on the scale of agreement. If you are at a 5 and your audience is in the same place as you, really believing the things that you're saying, then yeah, shaking people and trying to activate them makes a lot of sense. But if someone is a 1 or a 2 or even a 3, and they haven't bought into your premises yet, and you're shaking them, then you're just going to seem crazy or you're going to make them very defensive. Kind of for the same reason that if someone's a vegan and they believe that slaughterhouses are just the most morally atrocious thing, they're not going to go around into restaurants slapping hamburgers out of people's hands. It might be consistent with their worldview, but it's not going to make people more receptive to their message. Most of the time. You might get someone like me who believes a lot of the vegetarian argument, still eats meat anyway because, inertia and convenience. And maybe in my case, being shaken could get me on board, but that's kind of an exception. And you really have to know your audience to know when that strategy works versus when it's going to backfire. Now, the goal of activation, and which is why I really like my role as an onboarder, is to inspire and empower. Because talking about AI, existential risk especially, can be a real downer. And that can actually be a point of resistance to buying into the message. Hey, I got enough problems, and you're telling me that the world's going to end unless we make really big changes. I don't want to believe that because that's going to make me depressed. So I'm just going to block it out. One thing that's very important is that depressed state is not where you stay. And it may be useful to actually say that up front. As an analogy, in fiction, a very typical pattern, if you plot the protagonist's happiness or satisfaction with the world over the course of the story, they'll start off in a place of stasis, and then the major conflict of the story comes out, and things get worse until they get to their absolute worst at the main point of the conflict. And then things resolve, often fairly quickly, and you get to a new point of stasis that's better than where it was at the beginning. This is the same arc of communication that should ideally happen when talking about AI. Before you know about it, whether the person's optimistic or pessimistic, that can vary. Where their stasis is going to be different for everyone. But then hearing about all this stuff, it's going to get a lot worse. But you don't stop there. You then start to resolve that tension and end up in a place of, well, if we were to actually solve all these problems around AI, that would require shifting how we make decisions as a society so that it's not just the billionaires calling all the shots and everyone else gets no say. Not only that, if AI was made safe, there are a lot of fantastic things that could be done with it. And so the end result, if everything goes well, is actually better than it is now. But to get to that place of being better, you have to go through that valley where it's temporarily worse. In inspiring and empowering people, this involves really just making the issue real and combating defeatism, where they're saying, oh, there's nothing we can do. It's like, well, you're going to be like right here. You're going to start providing a resolution and lifting them up to get them to this place here. The activation is in this resolution line right here. If you want some ideas as to how to combat defeatism, I talk about this a little bit in my actions ecosystem video and describing the full process for how a social movement can work to give some credibility to the idea that solutions are possible. The sections towards the end is probably the most relevant here. Okay, and lastly, there is conversion. This is by far the most difficult of the three forms of messaging. A common mistake here is to try to just overwhelm the other person with logic. This rarely works unless the other person is just unusually receptive and open. More often than not, there's going to be some resistance, and you can't just steamroll that in a way that's going to be convincing. You might win the argument, but you're not going to convince anyone. I find the way to be most convincing is to show the other person that you understand them. And a very effective technique is active listening. You see this in therapy, in education, in conflict resolution, in negotiation. It's all over the place because it works. It's a really simple idea of just repeating what the other person says back to them. And this does a bunch of things. First, it forces you to listen. If you're mentally preparing what you're going to say next while the other person's talking, then when you try to repeat things back, you're not going to remember. You have to get them to say it again. That's kind of embarrassing, and that forces you to really listen. It also shows that you understand, because you're not just stating their words back word for word verbatim. You're paraphrasing or summarizing them in a way that you understand. And that shows that you've really thought about what they've said, that you've processed it, because you couldn't have stated things back if you hadn't done that. If your paraphrase is wrong, if it leaves out some important detail, or the little change you make is something that's really important, this gives the other person to course correct you and say, no, that's not what I meant. I meant this other thing. That's really useful. If you want to understand the person, they know what they're saying. They're the ultimate authority there. This is really good information for you. It helps you frame your understanding of where the other person's coming from so that you can really speak to them. Once you've really understood the key point of disagreement, only then does it make sense to start making arguments. Because if you're arguing against something that they don't really believe or is downstream of something that's more important, then everything you say is going to fall flat. And it's just going to be frustrating because it's like, this person just doesn't get me. I'm gonna tune them out. I'm going to dig in and become more polarized against them. So I should say about conversion is that there are some dangers in having this kind of conversation. First, there is a risk of the other person digging in, particularly if you get any of this active listening wrong or the person's just very obstinate, then talking about it and restating their disagreement can cause them to reinforce their opposition, especially if something about the conversation makes them angry. And even if it goes well, a conversion conversation is always going to take a lot of time. That might be fine if you're just having a conversation with a friend. But if you're in a situation where you really need to be using your time effectively, say you're handing out flyers and trying to find new volunteers, if you have a 45-minute conversation with someone and maybe you manage to move them from a 1 to a 2, that's great. But in that time, you could have had 5 or 6 shorter conversations with people who are already sympathetic, and maybe a couple of them become volunteers. It's a question of how you want to spend your time. I don't think there's necessarily a clear right answer. Like in terms of growing a movement rapidly, finding people who are ready to be activated is probably the most effective. However, at some point, there's going to be commonly formed opinion. It's going to be necessary for people with very different views to work together. If AI just becomes another polarized topic where one group of people believes this and another group of people believes that, everyone just digs in, then we're going to get the same political paralysis that we see in left-right divides. So if you want to work on proactively decreasing that polarization, conversion can be very useful. It just has a very different purpose. Another danger of conversion is that sometimes you'll get people who are just trolling you and have no interest in being open. They're just trying to waste your time, get under your skin, make you angry. Those sort of people, the best thing is to just disengage. Don't give them the satisfaction of making you angry. Moving on to the next variable is background knowledge. Again, there's a scale here where on one end, you have someone who's totally new. At the other end, you have someone who is like an expert on the topic, and then everywhere in between. Where they are tells you how much you need to explain as you're talking. If someone's totally new, any piece of jargon is something you're going to have to go into. In many cases, it may be better to just give overly simplified ideas so you can skip past that. With someone who's more knowledgeable, you can make a bunch of assumptions. You can use terms of art and assume that they'll know what that means, or they can ask questions whenever you're wrong. Getting this trade-off right is important because if you assume too much prior knowledge, obviously the other person's going to get confused. But if you just assume too little, then you can come across as being patronizing. It's also important here to see where you are on the scale and be honest with that. Where you are relative to the person you're talking about is going to relate to the social status line in terms of relationship. One quote I'm going to leave you with here on this slide. This is from a really interesting interview from Rob Miles about AI safety communication. People tend to overestimate how much their audience knows and underestimate how much they can learn. This is a very useful idea for a default when talking to people is expect to explain things, including things that you've forgotten being confused about. But don't use that as a reason to assume that people can't handle the complexity of the topic. People can learn very quickly if you explain things well. Kind of related to background knowledge is cultural reference frame. Although I treat this as a separate variable because whereas background knowledge is just like how much stuff they know, cultural reference frame is more related to what sort of ideas they're going to be more or less sympathetic towards. As a couple of examples, a effective altruist is likely to be very sympathetic to AI safety messaging. They probably already know about it. You're talking to someone in this group, there's a very high chance that you're going to be using activation type messaging. So an effective altruist group would be a very good place to find a lot of volunteers very quickly. The next one is a liberal environmentalist. People in this group are likely to be very sympathetic to the idea of big corporations causing lots of externalized harm, making decisions without regards to the rest of society or even long-term self-interest. They're also sympathetic to the idea of human actions being able to cause the end of the world. If you can simply connect some of those basic intuitions and say, hey, these apply to AI, a lot of the work is done for you. Next, people who are more conservative or religious. Here, there's a little bit of a mix because on the one hand, they have that same distrust of the big tech corporations. They're also sympathetic to the idea that massive changes can have all kinds of unintended side effects that destroy communities and break traditions. Radical change isn't necessarily good. On the other hand, there also could be potentially a fair amount of distrust of government seizing power as a solution. So talking about the problems of AI, they might be very much with you, but then when you say, okay, well, now we need international regulation imposed by world government, ooh, wait, maybe not. And at this point, I'd say it's useful to have the humility to admit that solutions are fundamentally harder than problems. Yes, there are dangers of giving government a lot of power, specifically in terms of it getting captured or corrupted. And these are real problems. And how to solve that isn't totally obvious, but that doesn't negate the problem. And they'll have like additional reasons for being concerned, including the impact that AI has on culture. The more people outsource their thinking to generative AI systems, the more control that Silicon Valley elites have on imposing their values and morality on everyone else. So I think a good frame here would be to really get to a common understanding of the problem and also incorporate their specific concerns in addition to the ones that you bring into it and say, yeah, those are big problems too. And then treat the question of solutions as being a little more nuanced and something that requires a lot of different perspectives to really get right. The first idea of we need a big government solution, that might not be the best thing, or maybe it needs to be pursued with care. That's actually the goal of Pause AI. What we really need here is democratic control. We need to hear everyone's voice in terms of what the path forward is. And so being as inclusive as possible will make the core message that we have both a lot more palatable and also more honest. I think we have a very good view of the problem here, but exactly what's needed is a much more complex question. One more political ideology I want to highlight here is libertarian. And these ones are the most likely to be lower on the scale of agreement, ones and twos, because the common sentiment here is both that markets and technology tend to work out for the best despite little disruptions that happen in the short term, and also that government can have a bunch of problems as a solution. So you're going to may face skepticism both on the problem and on the solution side, and that's just going to be a harder conversation. People are individuals, they can be different, but this is just a little bit of a baseline in terms of how politics can affect the starting point for these conversations. Besides politics, there's all other aspects of people's identity, their race, nationality, local community. These kind of things are going to affect what kind of words they're familiar with and what connotations they associate with various words. It's going to affect philosophical assumptions. And also, the more distant your culture is from the person that you're talking to, the more invisible barriers there are going to be in communication. And so the more mindful you need to be in terms of making sure you really understand what they're saying and where they're coming from. Moving on to points of resistance, this starts to get a little bit more into common talking points. Listing a couple of them, some people resistance to our message comes from a belief that artificial general intelligence is never going to happen for whatever reason, or maybe that it'll be aligned to our values by default if we just train it like children or something like that. Another point is that AI, even if AI isn't aligned, it can be controlled. Well, you can just unplug it if it starts being evil. Or maybe it can't be controlled, but that doesn't matter. The risk is worth it because there's a race and we need to win. Another point of resistance is that the kind of radical change that AI is going to bring is a good thing. Yeah, it's kind of scary and there's going to be a lot of disruption, but ultimately it'll work out for the best somehow. Coordination and activism is hopeless. What's going to happen is going to happen, and we just shouldn't try to change course. Or maybe there is something that could be done, but hey, I've just got enough problems and I don't want another thing to have to think about. My point in bringing all of these up is to show the variety of points of resistance and that it's really important that you're speaking to the right one. If someone's point of resistance is that activism is hopeless, and then you keep talking about how AGI is coming soon or that alignment is not easy, then there's going to be a mismatch. Or if they're believe that there's a race and that you need to win, and you're talking about the value of activism, that would also be a mismatch. The more you can be aware of all the different points of resistance there are, the easier it'll be to identify what category someone is in. One resource that I've created in terms of being able to identify where people are in terms of their beliefs about AI is a mind map I've created on Figma. There'll be a link in the description. Covers all of the most common arguments about AI that I have seen, starting with basic X-risk thesis and then various ideas branching off from that. Human extinction is good is like rejecting the conclusion. AISI is a long ways away, rejects premise one, and so on. And you can just kind of scroll around and see all these various ideas. And I've also listed some names for each of them of people who seem to endorse those beliefs. So I highly recommend checking this out, getting familiar with how all the ideas relate to each other so that you can have the conceptual categories and be able to slot people into where they're to something adjacent to where they're coming from as quickly as possible. For something that's a little bit more in depth in terms of coming up with counter arguments and getting your talking points, I highly recommend aisafety.info. This is a collaborative project led by Rob Miles and a bunch of volunteers. This just has a whole list of questions that you can ask. You can like search or you can click on things like, do people seriously worry about this? And it gives a short response. And then you can continue reading to related questions. Sure how effective this site is for conversion, because in order to read this, this takes a lot of time and energy to go through all of it. And so you kind of have to already go in there being really interested. There isn't a lot of emotional pull to get someone to read it. However, this is a fantastic resource for you as a communicator in knowing and being prepared for all the objections someone might throw at you. So if you're in a conversation and then someone suggests something like, oh, I'd never thought of it, then what I would recommend as a response is to just say like, oh, I had not considered that angle. I'd like to think about it before shifting any of my views here. Then you can go on aisafety.info and look up that point and see what the response is, decide for yourself whether you find it convincing, and know that for next time. Most objections fit into some clear category, but every once in a while, you're going to get objections that are just weird. And I can't even bring up examples off the top of my head. They're just like such head scratchers that I don't even know where the person's coming from. What I find here is that very often the weird objections ultimately distill down to one of the more common points of resistance, but they're just expressed in a weird way. Some reasons why that can happen is, well, first is unshared references. Let's be honest, PauseAI is a bit of an echo chamber. We have a bunch of people who all agree with each other, sharing their points of view. There's certain consensuses that emerge, and so then those just get assumed as we talk about things further. And that's not a problem or an issue with the server. That's just a natural result of like-minded people being in a group. It's just something that you have to push against by having space for disagreement and by getting outside of your bubble every once in a while. And I think our organization's pretty good about that. However, there's two issues here. One is that you're going to have a lot of assumptions that you may have forgotten about, and may come out and will just confuse the person you're speaking to unless you become aware of it and bring that assumption to the surface and talk about it explicitly. And also, the other person that you're speaking to is very likely going to be in their own set of echo chambers, which build up their own set of unstated assumptions, which can be confusing to you. Another issue that can lead to just weird expressions is what I call buffer reasoning. I don't like a solution, so I'll dismiss that the problem that suggests that solution even exists. For example, someone doesn't believe that AI is going to be dangerous because they think that government regulation is going to make things worse. Logically, these don't connect at all. But on an emotional level, there actually is a connection because once I admit that AI is risky, then government regulations might make sense or as a thing that people will support and a thing that could then happen. And so there's a certain desire to just nip it in the bud and say, okay, well, this isn't even a problem so that I don't even have to think about having to protect against this solution that I think is terrible. When you see that, bring it out to the surface and say, we can treat these as separate. It's okay to believe in a problem, but not like a particular solution to it. And say, well, maybe there's a different solution to the same problem. The way I frame this type of thinking is when I hear someone say something weird, my first thought is, what are they protecting? What are they worried about that's bringing up a lot of emotional triggers here? Another quote regarding strange arguments is from my economics professor back in college, Yoram Bauman. He once said that people are stupid, but they're not that stupid. The context of this quote was the economic idea of the rational man. This idea that people have some set of coherent values, then they make their decisions to maximize those values. The reality is that people are not like that. People have all kinds of biases, all kinds of internal self-contradictions, and just personal idiosyncrasies. This difference between that idealized rational reasoning and the reality of bias and contradictions can lead one to say, oh, well, people are just stupid. This isn't very fair. There's almost always some kind of method to what looks on the surface as irrational behavior. And when you really dig into it, there's often a fair bit of hidden wisdom. So the last major variable is the medium of communication. On one end, there's face-to-face conversations, which are the highest bandwidth, and on the other end, there's text only. In-person communication is much more effective because there's all kinds of vocal intonation, facial expression that impact the feel and all kinds of other things that allow for more empathy to enter the conversation. There's just all this extra bandwidth that allows for more communication than is conveyed just in words. And so when you get rid of that and just have text, there tends to be a lot less capacity for empathy. And there's also a lot more miscommunication. But it doesn't feel that way when you're reading it. You feel like you're understanding what the person's saying just fine. You're just wrong a lot. It's also very easy in a text to forget that the person that you're reading is a real human being because you don't see a face there. These are just something to be really mindful of whenever you're in a low bandwidth communication to counteract that tendency. When someone says something that seems kind of abrasive, give them a little benefit of the doubt. Or if you can't, say something about it, like, hey, that sounded a little rude. Was that intentional? And give them a chance to self-correct rather than just immediately reacting in a way that would make sense if someone was equally hostile face to face. Another way that the medium of communication can be very important is in debate. So whether that's comments on social media or a formal public debate, a very important thing to be aware of here is that your target is the audience, not the person you're talking to. A lot of the advice that I just gave about active listening and empathizing and all that might not actually be relevant in the context of a debate because, yes, that's what's most important to convincing the other person, but that's not your focus. I'm not an expert on debate. It could be that being the kind of nice, empathic person will cause the audience to be more sympathetic to you and more receptive to your message. Or it could be that they're going to go with whoever appears dominant, more self-assured. That's just a very different set of considerations. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but just know that what makes sense in a debate might not make sense in a one-on-one conversation and vice versa. Next, if you're handing out flyers or calling people on the telephone or at a protest, that also changes your considerations because trying to convert people might not be worth your time. It's very important to know what your goal is. Are you trying to depolarize people to create a more healthy discourse? Or are you trying to just find as many volunteers as you can? Or are you trying to advertise the message and get the ideas out there to as many people as possible so that they're more receptive to later messaging that they come across? Another consideration is if you're writing a blog or filming a video, then it becomes impossible to really respond to the person you're talking to because there is no back and forth. And so you can't find out who's listening. There's a really strong trade-off here because on the one hand, created content like this video, for example, you can put in a lot of time into really crafting a message. You can edit it and cut down the redundant bits. You can also speak to a lot more people with the same amount of your time. So it's a lot more efficient. But on the other hand, it's a lot less effective because you can't take all these other considerations that I've just listed out and tailor your message to the person. You just have to make some assumptions, put it out there. Some people, it'll be just the right thing. Other people, it'll be slightly off. Other people, it'll be totally useless, and you can't really control that. Which brings me to the topic of messaging for everyone. And I think hopefully by this point, with all these variables I brought out, it should be pretty clear that there is no one size fits all for communication. There's no focus is inherently better than another. I cringe a little bit whenever I hear people on PauseAI talking about, should we talk about X risk or should we talk about job loss? Like, no. Talk to your audience and figure out what they're receptive to and respond to that. Like list them all and see what gets a reaction. If you don't know, that's a problem. Figure that out. And you can only do that by talking to them. If you're creating media that's going to go out broadly, then it's a question of what exists already versus what's a gap in the communication. And then who do I advertise this message towards? Like what kind of forum should I post it on? What kind of following should I build out? If I'm maintaining a channel, am I being consistent in the audience that I'm talking to? Like those are the kind of considerations, not just what message is best. And if you try to cut away all of the assumptions entirely, then you get into this issue of trying to speak to everyone and really speaking to no one. You need to be able to make assumptions. Just know that you're doing that. Choose them based on reasons that make sense, and then make sure that it's consistent with the rest of your strategy. That said, in terms of messaging for everyone, there are some ways you can optimize. But rather than thinking of it in terms of making better messaging, think of it in terms of making less bad messaging or how you can get out of your own way. So if you have unnecessary jargon or fluff, cut that. If you're making assumptions about your audience that aren't warranted or not making assumptions that are, modify that. And then there's also all kinds of questions about like rhetorical tricks, how to state a talking point. If you've chosen what you're going to say, how do you say that in the punchiest sort of way? That's a whole topic in itself, but that's kind of a narrow question after you've decided what sort of conversation you're having in the first place. Another point, and this is kind of a general point of this video, is remember all these considerations when you're critiquing others. If someone is writing a particular message that's to a particular group of people and you're not in that group and you don't like the message, it's like, oh, this is too long, or it's not emotional enough, or it focuses on the wrong things. Okay, maybe, but are you evaluating this piece of work on its own terms? What is the audience that it's trying to speak to? What are the assumptions that it's making? Given that, is it achieving that well? Is it being consistent? That's a really critical starting point for giving any kind of meaningful critique to someone else's messaging. As a quick example for categorizing things, I have a debate on my channel with someone who identified, at least partially, as effective accelerationist, and I've come up with a little checklist for categorizing conversations. This sheet is going to be linked in the video. Or if you want to practice having a conversation, then you could use this as like a character sheet to give to the person you're practicing with. For now, I'll say if you like to try out an exercise of categorizing a conversation, you can pause the video now, check out that debate. There'll be a link in the description, and try to fill this out for the other person. assuming that either you did that or you're not interested. And I'm going to show how I filled it out. I figured we're relatively equal status, so I put a 3 here. Our conversation was very friendly, so I had a 4 on familiarity. Agreement, I had a strong disagree. There were a lot of unstated assumptions that we shared, so on the whole, there was a lot of agreement. However, we focused our conversation on the points of disagreement, so I put a 1 here. On the level of engagement, it was definitely engaged. Actually, I probably could have put a 5 since he'd agreed to a recording. Background knowledge, I'd say knows a lot. His works in machine learning, but the conversations we're talking about were a little more philosophical, so it's hard to really be an expert there. Bandwidth, obviously, it was a video and it was a conversation, so a 4 and a 5. His culture, probably the most significant one, was being libertarian, and otherwise we're pretty similar, so there's actually not that many divides to cross over. Our point of agreement was that unaligned superintelligence would be bad, and our point of disagreement was that artificial general intelligence, in his view, is a long ways off, and the near term is going to be relatively normal. Couple of notes from the debate is one, I feel like it went pretty well. And the things that helped it go well were that we maintained a pretty friendly tone and there was active listening on both of our parts. I also want to note here that the importance of not being too rigid in categorization. Although he identified as an effective accelerationist, he was also very different from the stereotypical example, specifically in not believing in AGI soon. It's kind of a non-characteristic belief of that organization. Is also very optimistic about society in general. It is not this kind of nihilistic Landianism that society is falling apart and we need AI to save us. And so if I went in assuming all the standard EAC beliefs, then I wouldn't have been listening. This also goes for me. My beliefs are not 100% the same as everyone else in PauseAI. I'm an individual, including being a progressive liberal environmentalist, which some people at PauseAI are. Some people are not. Some are more conservative. Some have other concerns. I'm not super positive on technology, which again is definitely not the norm there. And I have a somewhat revolutionary mindset, meaning that if you have a problem that seems fairly intractable, often rather than just trying to solve it directly, it's more useful to kind of look at the larger context in the system of which that problem is a symptom, along with many others, and try to address that. And when you're thinking about things on this larger systemic level, then the kind of changes that are needed are naturally going to be a lot more sweeping and radical. These are all things that are personal to me and not true of everyone in PauseAI. The reason I bring these up is when you're having a disagreement, it can be useful to distinguish between where am I arguing as a representative of this organization that I'm a part of versus where am I just arguing my own beliefs, so that you don't give people the wrong idea as to what your organization is about. Now, I'd like to mention at this point that there's been something bugging me about all this, which relates to the question of honesty. In rationalist circles, they sometimes refer to a lot of persuasion techniques as the dark arts, and I have a certain sympathy to the worldview there. However, as with any impulse, there's two extremes. One is to just brush an impulse off because it's not rational, and the other is to treat it as an absolute truth without question. And I find the most useful way to deal with emotional impulses is a medium between the two, where you treat it as an indication that there's something worth paying attention towards. There's very likely something, and it's worth looking at. Yeah, in this case, I think it's absolutely true that a lot of the information I've been talking about in this presentation can be used to manipulate people. However, I'm not particularly worried about this for two reasons. One is that people who are, well, let's just say liars, they already know this stuff. They tend to figure all these things out intuitively. I'm not really arming anyone with weapons they don't already have. The second reason I'm not really worried is that ultimately what drives honesty is integrity. It's more important to have that than it is to simply be incapable of using additional channels to mislead. Another thing that gives like an intuitive hit of something feeling a little bit off is that being explicit about things that are normally implicit feels kind of weird. Often, if something's a convention, maybe there's a reason for it. What's the reason for breaking that convention? And I think there actually is a good reason, which is that whenever you're speaking across some kind of inferential distance or a cultural boundary, then that interaction isn't going to be totally natural, even when it's done well. And so a certain degree of mindfulness is necessary whenever you're having any kind of difficult conversation. In this modern world where people grow up in all kinds of different subcultures and have all kinds of different backgrounds and experiences and all mashed together all the time, then that crossing of boundaries is a norm rather than an exception. So it's something that we should explicitly train for. What this all points to is that all of these things about understanding the underlying dynamics of communication, the purpose of that is so that you don't say unintended things. These channels of communication just exist, whether you're aware of them or not. And if you're not aware of them and you're using them in a way that isn't mindful across a boundary of someone who interprets things differently, that's going to create miscommunication. So if you're aware of that, then you can direct it. You can actually be more honest by fully saying what you mean. Yes, you could use that to change those subtle things to mislead in ways that the other person doesn't see. That goes back to integrity. If you're speaking with integrity, honesty is not going to be an issue. I think I'll end with a slide with a couple of quotes that I really like. The first one is from St. Francis of Assisi: seek first to understand, then to be understood. I believe that often the biggest barrier to changing someone's mind is when that mind is closed. It's not open to being changed. And the biggest barrier to openness is a feeling of not being understood. So if you can provide a clear sense of understanding, have it and show it, then that can lead to openness, and that can lead to a transformative conversation rather than just people getting stuck and polarized. One consequence of this way of approaching conversations is that opening others ultimately involves opening yourself. If there is no chance of you changing your mind in any way, maybe the chance of you suddenly thinking a pause on AI is a bad idea is pretty low because you've thought about it a lot, and maybe more than your person you're talking to. That it's unlikely they're going to give any radically new ideas that'll change your mind there. Well, first, never say never. And then second, there's also a good chance that your mind might get changed in subtle ways, like realizing that some particular solution that you're attached to has some side effects that you hadn't fully considered. And maybe the end result of what should actually be done is a little bit more nuanced than you came into the conversation believing. Having that kind of openness is useful, one, for just making sure that you have as comprehensive an understanding of reality as you can, which makes sure that you're, pushing in the right direction. Also, it models what you want to see in the other person. If you're going to ask for openness, then it's hypocritical not to be open yourself. And this leads to the other quote from game designer Chris Crawford: a conversation is an interaction where two participants alternately listen, think, and speak. This is a really useful view for troubleshooting conversations, because when it falls flat, it's very often because one of those three elements is missing from one of the two people. Conversations are hard, especially when we're so used to having so many not great conversations. But when those happen and all of the pieces are in place and they're just good and they flow and there's mutual understanding, that addresses a really basic need for connection that all people have, and is a tremendous gift that you can give to other people as well as to yourself. If you can have a conversation and maybe you don't make the best points, but the interaction was deeply fulfilling, that's going to be the thing that the other person remembers the most. And then if they associate that positive interaction with the cause that you're supporting, that can actually go further towards convincing than almost any words you could use, and ultimately can be life-changing. So with that, I hope you can all go out and change the world one conversation at a time.